The cardboard box was heavy enough to pull the seams of my canvas jacket tight against my collarbone. It was filled with cheap packs of adult undergarments, blue medical shop pads, and 2 plastic bottles of antiseptic soap. The exact items my uncle insisted only I could haul up 3 flights of concrete hospital stairs. I smiled at the floor nurse as I passed her station, nodding like the obedient, dutiful niece everyone in my family had trained me to be. I mean, to anyone walking down that corridor, I looked like a quiet girl doing her family duty without complaining. But right under the heavy lining of my work coat, resting flat against my ribs, was a single piece of folded white paper. A municipal repossession mandate. It was cold against my skin. And make no mistake, before the clock on that cafeteria wall hits 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, that paper is going to tear his entire world wide open. Honestly, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to stand in a sterile room, carrying someone else's heavy boxes with a fake smile plastered on your face, while holding the exact piece of paper that proves they turned your whole life into a lie? How long do you think you could keep your hands from shaking before you dropped the burden on their feet? Truth be told, I've spent 8 years learning how to keep my hands still under extreme heat. I'm an industrial pipe welder by trade. Out on the shipyards and high-pressure steam lines, you don't get the luxury of losing your temper. If your hand quivers even a millimeter while you're laying down a root pass on a 4-inch Schedule 80 carbon pipe, you trap gas beneath the slag. Trapped gas turns into hairline cracks. And when that line hits 3,000 pounds of steam pressure, the whole joint blows apart. You learn to diagnose the world by its structural defects. You listen for the faint, high-pitched hiss before the pipe ruptures. For the past 6 months, my entire life has been running on the thinnest margin of survival. Every single morning at 4:30, I'd sit in the cab of my rusted backup truck, staring at the shield of my safety goggles. The front visor had a spiderweb crack running right through the center of the viewport, a nasty line from a flying piece of hot slag on a pipeline jog down in the marsh. A proper replacement visor costs $42. Just $42. But when you have $0 in your checking account, $42 might as well be $40,000. So I took a roll of high-adhesion clear electrical tape from my tool bucket and wrapped 3 tight, overlapping layers across the glass. Every time I struck a high-frequency arc at work, the white-hot light hit those taped edges and scattered into blinding purple halos across my vision. If you've never welded with damaged optics, you don't know the constant terror of arc flash. It's a specific kind of agony where the ultraviolet light slowly cooks your retinas, and by midnight, your eyes feel like someone scooped up a handful of dry, coarse sand and ground it under your eyelids while you tried to sleep. I took that risk every day. Every single day. Just to save $42. The only thing in my truck that didn't feel like a compromise was a heavy, dented steel thermos sitting on the passenger floorboard. My father gave it to me 3 weeks before a structural beam gave out on a bridge project in '98. The outer green enamel was almost entirely gone, scraped down to the bare, oxidized gray metal from decades of being thrown into metal toolboxes and dragged through muddy utility trenches. It's got a deep dent right near the base where a 5/8-inch impact wrench fell on it from a scaffolding rig. But the internal vacuum seal never broke. It holds boiling black tea hot for 16 hours, even when the air around it drops below 0. It's heavy. It's cold to the touch until you feel it. It was the only piece of my father I had left. And while I was wrapping electrical tape over my eyes and drinking cold tap water out of that steel vessel to save pennies, my Uncle Arthur was living like a country king on my dime. The crazy part is, he didn't even steal from me in the dark. He did it while holding a wooden cross and looking me dead in the eye. Uncle Arthur built his entire personality on being the pious, self-sacrificing patriarch of the family. If anyone bought a house, he had to give the opening prayer. If anyone got sick, he was the one taking photos by the bed for Facebook, telling everyone how the Lord tests the faithful through suffering. And whenever he wanted something he hadn't earned, he weaponized traditional family guilt like a sledgehammer. He'd look at me with this soft, tragic disappointment and say, "Blood is thicker than water, Rhea, and God tests our vanity through sacrifice." I remember the exact day I earned my Master Welder certification. I spent 14 straight hours inside an unvented steel testing booth in 90-degree heat, laying down 3 flawless coupon welds under radiographic inspection. My hands were blistered. My shirt was soaked through with salt and sweat. I called Aunt May from the parking lot, my voice shaking with excitement, asking if I could come over so we could celebrate with a $5 pizza. She didn't even let me finish the sentence. She dropped her voice into this hushed, dramatic whisper, telling me that Uncle Arthur had just suffered a sudden, life-threatening chest spasm and couldn't even handle the sound of visitors. She said they were both lying in the dark, praying for his recovery, and that I should just go home and reflect on how fragile life was. I sat in my truck alone, eating a cold slice of gas station processed cheese on bread, feeling guilty for even asking. It wasn't until 2 months later that my cousin Toby, Arthur's 26-year-old son who has never held a job for longer than 3 consecutive weeks, accidentally dropped the truth. They hadn't been lying in the dark praying. Uncle Arthur had hosted a massive 50-person brisket barbecue out in the woods for his drinking buddies that exact evening. They had hired a live country band. They were throwing empties into a fire pit until 3 in the morning. They skipped my certification because a $5 pizza with the working-class niece didn't fit the image of a grand patriarch holding court. Toby didn't even apologize when he slipped up. He just smirked, leaned against the hood of my truck, and told me I was being bitter. Toby's the kind of guy who wears pristine leather work boots that have never seen a drop of mud or a single spark. He spent his days bragging about his outdoorsman lifestyle, going hunting, posting pictures of fire pits, talking down to me about how a real woman ought to be supporting her male elders instead of playing with industrial machinery. And Aunt May? Aunt May was his ultimate shield. She was paralyzed by this deep, pathetic terror of being abandoned. She was so terrified of Uncle Arthur walking out on her in her old age that she enabled every single lie he spun. If you ever tried to bring up facts, if you ever showed her a bank statement or asked where the money went, she would immediately execute her defense. Her hand would fly to her neck. She'd start gasping for air, claiming a sudden blinding migraine was taking her vision, crying out that we were killing her with stress. It was an engineered performance, and it worked every single time. The only reason I didn't completely lose my mind during those months was Miller. Miller was the senior shop foreman down at the commercial fabrication yard where I worked hourly shifts. He was 58 years old, missing the index and middle fingers on his left hand from an old bandsaw accident back in the 80s, and he spoke about 6 words a day. But Miller knew. He saw me sleeping in the cab of my truck in the corner of the gated shipyard lot because I couldn't afford the security deposit on a studio apartment. He never reported me to security. He just left the gate key under a spare brake drum near the fence line, and every Tuesday morning, a fresh pot of hot black coffee would be sitting on his workbench next to my tool tray. He looked at me one night while I was rewrapping my safety goggles under the shop lights. He pointed a scarred thumb at the main gate and said, "A bad weld doesn't care if you pray over it, Rhea. It's gonna snap the second the pressure hits. Stop trying to polish slag." He was right. You can't weld rust to clean steel, no matter how much heat you throw at it. And that brings me back to the paper in my coat and the small piece of trash tucked inside my right leather work glove. Yesterday afternoon, while carrying another load of Arthur's personal items into his hospital room, I picked up a small, folded scrap of paper off the linoleum floor right beside his bed. It was a mud-stained receipt from a rural gas station 30 miles out of town, dated 3 days ago, for 84 gallons of premium off-road diesel fuel. Arthur was sitting in that hospital bed, wearing a plastic pulse oximeter on his finger, complaining to the nurses that he was too weak to walk to the bathroom. But 3 days ago, someone paid cash for 84 gallons of heavy equipment fuel using his personal account. I stared at that little slip of paper, and for the first time in 6 months, the noise in my head went dead silent. That mud-stained receipt was the spark. And the white mandate in my pocket? That's the charge that's going to tear his entire fake empire down to the bare dirt. To understand how a person can steal $28,000 from their own blood while smiling, you have to understand how my Uncle Arthur used to look at me across a hospital tray. It happened 6 months ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that still sits in the back of my throat like sulfur. He had called me into his room, his voice dropping into that raspy, dying man whisper he only uses when he wants something he hasn't worked for. He had a stack of fake billing summaries laid out on his bed blanket, printed from some generic online template, showing astronomical numbers for uninsured cardiology consultations. He looked me straight in the eyes, his hands trembling with orchestrated panic, and told me that the hospital was going to file a lien against the family. He said he was facing immediate personal ruin, that he was going to be thrown out onto the street in a wheelchair if he couldn't liquidate cash immediately. And then he brought out the leash. He leaned forward, lowering his voice even further, and mentioned that if he couldn't clear those debts, he'd have no choice but to sell the deed to my grandmother's burial plot. The plot right next to my father. He claimed a private cemetery developer had already offered him cash for the rights, and he said he was praying that God wouldn't force his hand to sell my father's resting place to strangers. That was the trap. He knew I had spent 4 years building my independent welding business. He knew my entire life's work was wrapped up in my custom-tuned $28,000 diesel welding generator, a heavy 3-phase monster mounted on the back of my primary utility truck that allowed me to take high-paying pipeline contracts. He looked at me and basically demanded that I sign over the vehicle titles and equipment release forms so he could sell them for scrap to clear his medical bills. I remember. My chest just caved in. It felt like an unvented steam pipe taking 3,000 pounds of sudden hydraulic pressure. Every breath I tried to pull into my lungs turned into this thin, suffocating hiss of escaping air. My hands went completely numb, the cold sweat pooling at the small of my back while I stared at the signature line on those transfer papers. $28,000 of custom industrial machinery, built through 80-hour work weeks in freezing mud, wiped out with one stroke of a pen. And do you want to know what he gave me in return? What he handed me to compensate for taking away my entire financial future? He reached into his cardigan pocket, pulled out a flimsy $10 generic gas station gift card, and slid it onto the plastic tray in front of me. He smiled this soft, tragic, condescending smile, and told me to use it for bus fare. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "The Lord will provide, Rhea, but right now he needs you to provide for your family. Stop being so attached to earthly metal. Pray for a softer heart." $28,000 for my independent livelihood versus a $10 piece of cheap plastic. Honestly, let me stop right here and ask you something. If you've ever had to stand in a room and watch a narcissistic relative use religious guilt and family scapegoating to rob you of your entire financial independence, tell me, how did you keep your hands from shaking? How did you stop yourself from screaming when you realized they were using your own dead father as leverage against you? I couldn't scream, because the second I opened my mouth to ask for the official scrapyard release forms, the whole room turned on me like a pack of stray dogs. I looked at him and said, "Uncle Arthur, where is the licensed scrapper's bill of sale? I need the official tax documentation for—" "Are you serious right now?" Cousin Toby cut me off immediately, stepping up from the windowsill and towering over my chair. My dad is sitting in a hospital bed with failing health, and you're demanding tax paperwork? You are wildly out of line, Rhea. You're acting completely unhinged over some rusty equipment. I need to see the liquidation receipt, I started to say, but my voice cracked. And right on cue, Aunt May executed her move. Her hand shot to her collarbone. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she let out this loud, agonizing gasp that echoed off the white tile walls. Arthur! My chest! My head is splitting open! The stress! She's killing me with this stress! She slumped backward into her vinyl armchair, fanning herself frantically with a hospital magazine, her breathing turning into shallow, dramatic wheezes. Uncle Arthur looked at me with cold, quiet disgust. Look at what you're doing to your aunt, he whispered, pointing a shaking finger at her. Is this how you honor your father's memory? Because if I have to call the cemetery director tomorrow morning to liquidate that plot just to pay for May's emergency stress medicine, that's on your conscience, Rhea, not mine. They had me locked in a vice. If I pushed for the receipts, Aunt May faked a medical collapse, and Arthur threatened to sell my father's memory. I had to swallow the poison. I had to hand over the keys, pick up that insulting $10 gas card, and walk out of that hospital room in absolute, silent defeat. 5 minutes later, I was sitting in the cab of my rusted backup truck in the dark corner of the shipyard lot. It was pouring rain. The heavy drops were slamming against the roof like loose gravel. I couldn't hold it in anymore. My hands, they were shaking so hard I couldn't even key the ignition. I pulled my safety goggles off my face, set them on the passenger seat beside my father's dented steel thermos, and I just broke. I leaned my forehead against the cold vinyl of the steering wheel and wept until my throat felt like raw sandpaper. I wasn't just crying because my savings were gone, or because I was facing a negative bank balance of $14. I was crying because I remembered sitting on a wooden bench when I was 9 years old, watching Uncle Arthur help my dad build a tool shed in our backyard. I remembered Arthur pouring hot tea from that exact steel thermos, laughing, hugging my dad and telling him that family was the only thing that mattered in this world. Sitting in that dark truck, I realized that the uncle from my childhood was dead. He was a ghost. The man sitting up in that hospital room was a cold, calculating predator who looked at my sweat and sacrifice as nothing more than raw fuel for his own vanity. I sat there in the dark for 20 minutes, listening to the rain, watching the moisture freeze on the windshield. And then, the weeping stopped. There is a fundamental law in metallurgy. When you apply intense heat to a joint without proper shielding gas, the atmospheric oxygen actively infects the puddle. It looks like solid steel on the surface, but underneath it is riddled with microscopic voids, pure structural porosity. That's what it means to survive this family. You pour your absolute biological maximum into holding the framework together, working 80-hour shifts with damaged optics just to keep their pressure lines from blowing. But their entire reality is a compromised weld. My uncle didn't just steal a generator. He actively engineered a system where his catastrophic failures were vented directly into my lungs. The sheer physical exhaustion of constantly grinding down their slag and pretending the metal is solid. It doesn't just break your back. It permanently alters your tensile strength. He will sleep perfectly fine tonight, swaddled in religious hypocrisy, while I sit in a freezing truck calculating exactly how many hours of my life it will take to buy back my own survival. I reached out, picked up my safety goggles, and stared at the clear electrical tape wrapped across the cracked visor. My reflection was stretched and distorted in the dark glass. In my line of work, when you inspect a structural pipe and find a deep, hidden pocket of slag buried inside the seam, you don't try to polish it. You don't pray over it, and you don't pretend the metal is solid just to keep people happy. You hook up the carbon arc gouger, turn the heat up to maximum amperage, and you blow the defective joint right out of the steel until there's nothing left but clean air. My uncle thought he had broken me. He thought he had turned me into a permanent, submissive worker bee who would keep quiet to protect the family name. He was wrong. I wiped my face with the rough canvas sleeve of my work coat. My jaw locked tight. I pulled the taped goggles back over my eyes, turned the key in the rusted ignition, and stepped out into the freezing rain to clock in for my 14-hour shift. The submissive niece was dead. The auditor had just walked onto the job. 3 days after I handed over those keys, I was driving my rusted backup truck along a muddy logging route 30 miles north of the shipyard. The timber road was pitted with deep gravel ruts, and the cold morning sleet was hitting the windshield with a steady, rhythmic tap. I was on my way to inspect a cutoff valve on a regional pipeline extension, just standard hourly work for the local utility crew. My back left tire started pulling hard to the ditch, sloshing through the gravel like it was running on dry bearings. I pulled off into a gravel turnout near a rusted logging gate to check the air pressure. I stepped out into the mud, my heavy boots sinking an inch into the wet clay. And that's when I froze. It cut right through the sound of the wind in the pine needles. A low, heavy, low-frequency throb. A cyclic mechanical beat bouncing off the timberline, about 100 yards past the private gate. Most people listening to that sound would have just heard a distant engine. They would have thought it was a tractor or a timber skidder clearing brush. But I've spent 7 years standing 6 inches away from heavy industrial engines with an arc torch in my hand. You don't just hear an engine like that. You feel it in the bone, behind your ear. It was an 1800 RPM 4-cylinder diesel running under a 70% electrical load. But it wasn't just any motor. When I built my custom industrial welding rig 4 years ago, I tweaked the mechanical fuel governor myself, adjusting the idle bypass valve to eliminate the voltage drop when I struck a high-amperage rod on heavy plate steel. That governor gave the engine a very specific, high-pitched harmonic whine on the intake cycle. And more than that, my custom welded exhaust manifold had a tiny, hairline baffle rattle inside the outer shield. A distinct double click every 4 revolutions that I knew like my own pulse. I stood there in the mud, my tire pressure gauge dropping from my fingers into the wet clay. My heart didn't race. It stopped. That double click echoed off the trees again. Click, click, throb, throb, click, click. My equipment hadn't been sold for scrap to pay a hospital bill. My custom-welded $28,000 rig was running at full throttle right behind that logging gate. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just walked along the tree line, keeping my body low beneath the dripping hemlock branches, slipping through a gap in the boundary fence where the wire had rusted through. I moved 50 yards through the wet brush until the forest opened up into a wide gravel clearing. And there, sitting right in the middle of a 5-acre private timber lot, was a brand new 2-story cedar log cabin. It had a wraparound timber deck, custom stone fire pit, and 2 expensive utility quads parked under the eaves. And parked right beside the rear porch, sheltered beneath an aluminum awning, was my primary work truck. The blue steel chassis I had fabricated with my own hands was spotless. The heavy-duty output cables were plugged directly into an industrial transfer switch on the cabin wall, feeding crisp 3-phase power to a glowing outdoor hot tub, string lights across the porch, and a satellite dish mounted on the roof peak. My hands, they started shaking so violently that I had to press my back against the rough bark of a pine tree to stay upright. My throat went bone dry. The conditioned fear came roaring back like a tidal wave, that old suffocating family trap telling me to shut my mouth, turn around, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. I mean, my brain was short-circuiting. I actually felt this wave of pure terror that if I stayed there, if I took a photo, I would be the one ruining the family. I could hear Aunt May's theatrical gasps echoing in my ears. telling me I was a selfish, ungrateful monster who was going to drive my uncle into a grave over earthly metal. My thumb hovered over the power button on my phone for 10 agonizing seconds. My knuckles were white. The urge to turn back, to just accept the lie and keep wrapping tape over my safety goggles, it was almost overwhelming. It's terrifying how deeply you can be trained to protect the people who are actively tearing you apart. But then I looked at the side of my generator box. Right below the main breaker panel, someone had used a piece of yellow chalk to write, "Toby's rig. Keep off." Toby's rig. My cousin, the guy who lectured me on family sacrifice while wearing $80 designer shirts, had claimed my life's work as his personal toy for his weekend drinking pad. The fear didn't dissolve. It hardened. It turned into something icy and completely unyielding. I pulled out my phone, stepped out from behind the tree line, and began recording. I walked right up to the aluminum awning, keeping the camera steady. I took a 4-minute, high-definition video showing the VIN number stamped on the truck door, the custom serial plate I had riveted to the generator frame, and the exact physical connection where my industrial generator was feeding power to his luxury cabin. I didn't stop there. Once I had that video locked into a secure cloud storage drive, I drove straight to the county recorder's office in town during my lunch hour. I sat in the cab of my truck with my laptop connected to the county's public land registry portal. If Arthur had built a luxury cabin on a private lot while claiming total medical bankruptcy, he had to fund the land purchase somehow. It took me 45 minutes of digging through public tax liens and deed transfers before I found the second and third pieces of the puzzle. Arthur hadn't bought the land in his own name. He had registered the timber lot under a shell entity called Pine Creek Holdings, LLC. But when I pulled the notarized mortgage filings for that parcel, my chest went completely tight. He had taken out a $30,000 high-interest private lender mortgage to secure the acreage. And listed right on page 4 of the certified public filing was the guarantor's signature. It wasn't Arthur's name. It was Aunt May's. I zoomed in on the document until the high-resolution scan filled my entire laptop screen. The text read verbatim: "Borrower May Vance hereby unconditionally guarantees the full principal sum of $30,000, encumbering the primary residential property located at 412 Maple Street as collateral in the event of default." Below that line was Aunt May's signature, but the handwriting was completely wrong. The letters were stiff, angled sharply to the right, matching the exact slant of Arthur's handwriting on my old scrap transfer papers. He hadn't just stolen my generator. He had forged his terrified wife's signature on a high-interest private loan, putting her home on the line to build his off-grid playground. He was running on dry bearings, operating with this pure, slag-brained audacity, completely convinced that because he wore the crown of the family patriarch, no one would ever dare look behind the logging gate. I closed the laptop lid with a soft, quiet click. My hands weren't trembling anymore. The breathing pauses in my chest were slow, deep, and steady. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to call a family meeting. I just sat in the quiet cab of my truck, pulled up my municipal contractor portal, and began drafting the single document that was going to shut his entire operation down. Before I could even think about stepping into that hospital cafeteria to drop the mandate on his tray, I had to cut the leash he had wrapped around my throat. That was the most critical rule Miller taught me on the shop floor. You never strike an arc on a pressurized line until you've bled the manifold dry. If there's still fuel trapped in the bypass, the backfire will blow the torch right out of your hand. And Uncle Arthur's fuel, his absolute ultimate leverage, was my grandmother's burial plot. He thought he owned me because he held that piece of paper over my father's memory. At 2:15 that same afternoon, while the rain was coming down so hard the wipers on my backup truck were barely clearing 2 inches of glass, I pulled into the gravel lot of the County Municipal Archives building downtown. The heater in my cab was blowing lukewarm air that smelled like scorched dust and damp carpet. My hands were freezing, my knuckles raw and red from the cold. But I didn't care. I reached under the driver's seat and pulled out an old, grease-stained vinyl accordion folder my father had kept in his shop desk before he passed. Inside that folder, nestled between old pipe-fitting manuals and certified welding inspector logs, was the original 1994 purchase receipt for the family plot, signed by my grandfather. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the municipal building, my work boots squeaking loudly against the polished terrazzo floor. The basement air smelled like old paper, floor wax, and the sharp chemical tang of ammonia from a fresh mop bucket. I sat down at a small laminate counter across from an elderly municipal clerk named Harold, who wore a faded green cardigan and thick reading glasses resting on the tip of his nose. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a fast, erratic throb. But I kept my voice steady. I laid out my grandfather's original receipt, my father's death certificate, and my own master welder credentials on the counter. I looked at Harold and basically explained that my uncle had been claiming sole executorship over the family resting grounds, threatening to sell the adjacent plot to a commercial developer to cover unverified personal debts. I asked him to run a full title search on the parcel right there on his terminal. Harold didn't say much. He just nodded, his spectacles sliding down his nose while his thin fingers tapped away on an old mechanical keyboard. The rhythmic, loud clack, clack, clack of those keys was the only sound in that quiet basement office. It took 6 agonizing minutes. 6 minutes of watching his screen reflect tiny green lines of text across his glasses while my stomach twisted into a hard knot. And then Harold stopped typing. He leaned back in his vinyl swivel chair, let out a long, dry sigh, and adjusted his glasses. He looked at me over the monitor and basically said that Arthur had attempted to file a conditional quitclaim deed on that burial plot 3 weeks ago. But because the original 1994 deed was held in joint tenancy with my late father, and because my father's half of the estate had passed directly to me as his sole surviving heir, Arthur's unilateral filing was completely illegal. It was legally invalid without my notarized signature. Harold pulled a heavy, red-inked brass stamp off a wooden rack on his desk. He brought it down onto the public record file with a sharp, heavy thud. The sound echoed through the quiet basement like a hammer hitting an anvil. He slid a certified copy of the encumbrance freeze across the laminate counter. He looked me dead in the eye and said that effective right now, at 2:28 p.m., the plot was permanently locked under county probate review. Nobody could sell it. Nobody could transfer it. Nobody could touch a single square inch of that grass without my explicit written consent. Just like that, the hostage was gone. The leash Arthur had used to choke me for 6 months had just snapped completely in half. I stepped back out into the freezing rain, holding that certified county document tight against my canvas jacket. The wind was whipping down the alleyway between the courthouse buildings, but I didn't even feel the cold anymore. My chest, for the first time since that rainy Tuesday 6 months ago, actually expanded. I took a deep, full breath of the wet air, letting it fill my lungs without that suffocating, high-pitched hiss of panic. My next stop was 3 blocks down, at the Municipal Civil Enforcement Bureau. I walked into the small, fluorescent-lit office of the Municipal Civil Enforcement clerk, laid my custom generator's original bill of sale, my certified video recording from the cabin, and my time-stamped photos on the counter. I filled out the formal affidavit for civil asset recovery of stolen industrial machinery. The civil clerk on duty reviewed the VIN numbers, checked my custom chassis welds against the photos, and printed out a certified municipal repossession mandate. He attached a formal municipal escort notice to the front page, authorizing bonded civil recovery agents to enter the logging property at dawn to seize and impound the equipment. He folded the document once, neatly across the center, and handed it to me. I slid that folded Mandate inside the heavy inner lining of my canvas work coat, right against my ribs. It felt stiff and heavy against my skin. The leverage was broken. The legal net was cast. All that was left now was walking into that hospital cafeteria and watching him try to wriggle out of a trap that was already bolted shut. By 5 o'clock that evening, the rain had settled into a low, clinging fog that smelled like coal smoke and wet river mud. I drove back to the hospital, parking my backup truck in the dark overflow lot behind the laundry facility. I didn't rush. I didn't march up those stairs with my chest puffed out or a scowl on my face. Instead, I put on the mask. I made my shoulders slump just a little bit, let my hands look tired, and picked up the heavy cardboard box of adult care supplies I had purchased with my last $20. To anyone watching me walk through those sliding glass doors, I looked like the same broken, submissive girl who had been taking their beatings for 6 months. I carried those supplies up 3 flights of stairs, my boots making a slow, heavy rhythm against the concrete treads. I walked right into Uncle Arthur's room, setting the box down on the floor by his nightstand with a quiet, exhausted sigh. Uncle Arthur was sitting up in bed, sipping a warm cup of organic broth Aunt May had brought him from a health food store across town. He didn't even look up when I walked in. He was leaning back against his pillows, complaining in this low, whining voice about how the hospital's private room had terrible soundproofing and how the noise from the hallway was giving him an ungodly tension headache. Cousin Toby was sitting in the vinyl corner chair, scrolling through a hunting gear catalog on his phone, occasionally chiming in to agree that the family deserved better accommodations. They made me stand there for 10 minutes while Arthur complained about his broth being too salty, forcing me to carry his dirty travel bags back and forth across the room to clear space for Toby's jacket. Look, I want to ask you something right now. If you were standing in a room carrying armfuls of dirty coats, your knuckles raw from hauling heavy boxes, watching a man who stole your entire life's savings complain that his organic broth was too salty, would you have the sheer willpower to keep your mouth shut? Would you be able to swallow that pure, burning humiliation, smile softly, and ask him if he needed another pillow? Just to make sure he stayed completely blind to the trap you were about to drop on his head. Because that's what I did. I swallowed every drop of it. I bowed my head, apologized for the noise of my work boots, and kept my eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. And then his own arrogance handed me the final, undeniable proof. While I was leaning over his nightstand adjusting a stack of medical pads, my phone buzzed twice in my jacket pocket. A distinct double vibration signaling a message in the main family group chat. The group that included Aunt May, Toby, 3 of my cousins, and my late father's sister. I pulled my phone out half an inch, shielding the screen with my canvas sleeve. A text message had just popped up from Uncle Arthur's personal cell number. The notification preview read verbatim, "Make sure Rhea finishes carrying those supply boxes to my hospital room before she starts asking where the generator truck went. Tell her the scrappers hauled it away at dawn." My thumb hit the screen capture shortcut instantly. Snap. 2 seconds later, a small gray system line replaced it. Message deleted by sender. Arthur had meant to text Toby privately under the blanket. His thumb had slipped in his rush to manage the cover story, sending his explicit instructions directly to 15 family members. A microsecond later, he realized his mistake and wiped it from the chat. But the time-stamped ghost was already saved on my screen. A pristine image showing his unedited malice and his active plan to lie to me about the scrapper. Right on cue, Arthur tried to execute his damage control. He typed out a fast follow-up message to the group chat. "So sorry, family. Typed a note from my dictation app meant for the scrapyard coordinator. Rhea is working so hard, but poor thing is so confused and stressed lately. Let's keep praying for her peace of mind." Calculated concern, turning me into the unstable, confused scapegoat who just couldn't handle the stress, while he sat back and played the saintly patriarch trying to protect me. I didn't say a word. I didn't look up at him. I just slid my phone back into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, folded paper of the municipal mandate resting against my ribs. At 6:15, I left the hospital and drove straight down to the shipyard lot. The commercial fabrication shop was quiet at that hour. The heavy overhead cranes were parked at the end of the bays, and the air inside the main workspace smelled like warm ozone, cutting oil, and dry pine shavings. It was a massive industrial sanctuary, a place where things were measured in thousandths of an inch, and where bullshit didn't exist because the steel never lied. In the back corner of the main bay, a small orange glow was flickering inside Miller's small office shack. I walked over to the open door. Miller was sitting on a wooden stool beside a small kerosene heater, sharpening an old carbide lathe tool on a bench grinder. The high-pitched metallic whir of the grinding wheel filled the room, sending a shower of bright orange sparks cascading down into a tray of water. He didn't stop grinding when I walked in. He just nodded once, his eyes focused on the edge of the tool. I stepped inside, pulling my wet canvas coat off my shoulders, and sat down on an overturned cable spool. The heat from that kerosene stove hit my freezing face, warming the skin around my eyes where the tape on my goggles usually pressed. I pulled my late father's dented steel thermos out of my coat pocket, set it on the workbench between us, and reached into my pocket to pull out the folded municipal mandate. I didn't lay out a big dramatic story. I didn't cry. I just laid that folded paper down on the wooden workbench beside his coffee mug. Miller stopped the bench grinder. The wheel spun down slowly. Whir, click, click, stop. The sudden silence in that shop was absolute. Miller wiped his scarred hands on a greasy shop rag. He picked up his old, heavy ceramic mug, took a slow sip of black coffee, and looked down at the certified municipal stamp on the document. He didn't read every word. He didn't have to. He looked at the municipal escort stamp, looked at the VIN number of my generator, and then looked up at me. His weathered face didn't change, but his eyes, those sharp, gray eyes that had spent 40 years inspecting structural steel, held this quiet, fierce pride. He set his mug back down on the wood. He pointed one of his scarred, shortened fingers at the paper, then pointed out the window, toward the dark shipyard gate. "Rhea," he said, his voice low and raspy, like dry gravel sliding down a chute. "A bad weld doesn't care if you pray over it, but you've been burning your own rods to hold their rusted pipes together for too long. Real family isn't the people who mathematically calculate how much of your heat they can steal before you crack. It's the people who never once handed you a broken mask and expected you to fix their deliberate sabotage. It's going to snap when the pressure hits, so stop trying to polish slag. Let the joint blow." He picked up his sharpening tool, flipped the switch on the grinder, and went back to work. The sparks flew across the dark room again. I picked up my father's thermos, held its cold steel weight in both hands, and felt the last remaining shadow of hesitation completely burn away from my chest. Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., in the middle of that crowded hospital cafeteria, Uncle Arthur was going to find out what happens when 3,000 pounds of pressure hits a cracked joint. The hospital cafeteria at 6:45 in the morning smelled like scorched vegetable broth, industrial bleach, and cheap floor wax. It was a long, low-ceilinged room in the basement, lit by rows of flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed at a steady 60-cycle frequency. In my line of work, you learn to read a room's acoustic envelope fast. With 2 load-bearing concrete pillars flanking the entrance and rubberized linoleum underfoot, sound didn't dissipate in there. It bounced. Every drop of a plastic fork, every scrape of a vinyl chair echoed right off the glass tray dispenser line. It was a pressure vessel with 0 relief valves. If someone made a scene in a room like that, the sound would carry straight up the stairwell to the main security desk. Uncle Arthur had chosen the central table right beneath the main fluorescent bank. He was sitting in a high-backed chrome transport wheelchair, wearing a pressed flannel shirt and a navy blue blanket draped neatly across his knees. Aunt May sat to his right, fussing over a small paper cup of lukewarm chicken broth, while Cousin Toby stood beside the tray rail, holding a smartphone at eye level. Arthur had invited 3 members of his local prayer group to join them before his formal discharge, creating a little audience to witness his saintly endurance. "Hold still, Dad," Toby said, adjusting his grip on the phone. He adjusted his fleece vest, his manicured thumb tapping the screen. "I need to get the light right. The church page wants a photo of the recovery before we head out." Arthur put on his performance. He lowered his chin, let his shoulders slump into an expression of brave, pious exhaustion, and rested one pale hand over his heart. And then Toby turned his head toward me. I was standing 3 feet behind Arthur's wheelchair, my heavy work boots planted flat on the rubber tiles. In my arms, I was holding Arthur's heavy oilskin winter coat, Toby's wet canvas parka, and Aunt May's bulky wool coat. The combined weight was easily 25 pounds, damp, heavy fabric smelling of stale tobacco, road salt, and damp wool, pulling down hard on my shoulder joints. Arthur had insisted I hold them so he didn't look cluttered in the photo. He wanted me positioned right behind his left shoulder, a silent, drab, working-class backdrop to make his frail patriarch persona pop for the camera.
"Rhea, move 2 inches to the left,"
Toby snapped, his voice carrying that sharp, casual arrogance he always used when he wanted to feel important.
"You're blocking the light from the window. And Jesus, couldn't you have wiped the grease off your coat sleeve? You look like you just crawled out of a drainage ditch. People looking at the ministry page are going to think we don't feed you."
I didn't answer. I didn't shift my weight. I just stared at the back of Arthur's neck, feeling the damp cold from Toby's parka soaking through my work shirt, right where the folded municipal mandate rested against my ribs. Arthur took a slow, delicate sip of his broth, letting out a soft sigh that sounded like a dry valve leaking steam. He turned his face toward the 2 church ladies sitting across the laminate table, his eyes soft with orchestrated humility. "We have to protect our peace," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic tone he used when he was delivering a sermon from a hospital bed. When people carry toxic, worldly anxiety in their hearts, they project it onto the ones who love them most. I've had to set very firm, healthy boundaries with Rhea over these last few months, because her obsession with material metal is a spiritual sickness. Aunt May dabbed the corner of her eye with a crumpled paper napkin, nodding in hushed, reverent agreement. "It's been such a heavy cross for you to bear, Arthur," she whispered. "So heavy." "God tests us through hardship," Arthur continued, reaching out to pat May's hand while the 2 church ladies offered sympathetic nods.
"Blood is thicker than water, and even when a family member chooses resentment over grace, we must answer with forgiveness. I pray every night that the Lord softens her heart and teaches her that earthly possessions are just dust in the wind."
He leaned back in his wheelchair, completely basking in the admiring, hushed silence of the table. He was a man who had built a total kingdom out of stolen machinery, forged signatures, and fake chest spasms. Sitting in a public cafeteria surrounded by people who treated his word like gospel, I just stood there, in the shadow of his wheelchair, my arms aching under the weight of their wet coats, watching the steam rise off his generic paper cup of broth. And right then, looking at his smooth, combed gray hair under those buzzing lights, time just seemed to stop. I looked at him raising that paper cup to his lips, his eyes half closed in fake piety while he lectured strangers about protecting his peace, and I wondered, if a man spends his whole life building a fake empire out of stolen metal and victimhood, does he have any idea how fast the roof collapses when you cut the main support beam? Because the municipal recovery team waiting 3 miles down the logging road was about to answer that question for him in broad daylight. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice. and I didn't argue with Toby about the grease on my canvas sleeves. Instead, I just uncurled my arms. The heavy, wet pile of oilskin coats, canvas parkas, and wool jackets dropped straight out of my grip, slamming onto the rubberized linoleum floor with a heavy, sodden thud. The sound cut right through Arthur's sermon like an iron blade. The two church ladies froze mid-nod. Toby stopped scrolling his phone, his thumb hovering an inch above the glass, his mouth dropping open in shock. I didn't look at Toby. I reached under the heavy canvas lining of my work jacket, pulled out the cold, single-folded piece of white paper resting against my ribs, and stepped forward. I placed it squarely onto the middle of Arthur's plastic cafeteria tray, right beside his paper cup of organic chicken broth. For 3 seconds, the entire cafeteria seemed to lose its air. A single piece of ice shifted and clinked against the side of a glass inside the soft-serve machine across the aisle. That tiny, sharp clink was the only sound in the dead silence of that room. Arthur looked down at the white paper. His fake, pious expression glitched, his eyes narrowing as he read the bold, black municipal seal stamped across the top margin. His pale, manicured hand reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the document. His eyes scanned the first 3 lines. Civil Asset Recovery Mandate, Municipal Court Order Number 408-B. Immediate seizure of stolen industrial property and mandatory municipal escort. I watched his face, and make no mistake, my heart was hammering like a high-pressure pneumatic rivet gun against the inside of my ribs. My vision swirled for a microsecond, that old, biological wave of conditioned panic trying to knock my knees out from under me. My hands wanted to shake. My throat wanted to close up. But I dug the heels of my steel-toed work boots flat into the floor tiles, locked my jaw, and crossed my arms tight over my chest. I let the silence stretch. Arthur's face went from pale gray to a deep, dangerous crimson. The smooth, saintly patriarch mask he had worn for 30 years didn't just slip. It completely disintegrated into raw, ugly panic. His performative frailty vanished as he tried to stand, but his knees instantly buckled under the weight of the undeniable proof. He stumbled backward, his chair rolling slightly, and his trembling hands knocked into the laminate table. The paper cup of organic chicken broth flipped completely upside down, sending a wave of greasy, lukewarm yellow liquid splashing across his pressed flannel shirt, his navy blanket, and the certified municipal mandate. "What is this?" Arthur shrieked. His voice wasn't a raspy, dying man whisper anymore. It was a harsh, screeching roar that ripped through the quiet cafeteria, bouncing off the concrete pillars and echoing straight up the stairwell. "What did you do, you disrespectful, demonic little brat?" The entire hospital cafeteria went dead silent. 2 orderlies standing near the tray return station turned around. A floor nurse stopped mid-stride. Patients in yellow gowns, visitors holding coffee cups, and 3 hospital security officers standing near the main doors all turned their heads to stare at the man slumped over the wet table, broth dripping off his chin, gasping for air in pure panic. Toby stepped forward, his face turning pale as he looked at the security guards. Dad, sit down. What are you doing? People are looking." "Shut up, Toby!" Arthur screamed, his eyes wild and bloodshot, pointing a shaking, broth-covered finger right at my face. "She brought the authority into this. She filed a report on her own blood. You ungrateful snake. After everything I've done for this family, after all the prayers I've said for your miserable, cold heart, you try to ruin me over a piece of metal?" I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket, tapped the screen twice, and set it flat on the wet table right next to his overturned broth. The high-resolution screenshot of his deleted text message was glowing brightly under the fluorescent lights. The older church lady leaned forward, her spectacles sliding down her nose as she read the text aloud in a shocked, hushed whisper. Make sure Rhea finishes carrying those supply boxes to my hospital room before she starts asking where the generator truck went. Tell her the scrappers hauled it away at dawn. She stopped reading. She looked up at Arthur, sitting, slumped, screaming, covered in broth, and then looked back down at the screen showing his exact time-stamped instructions to lie to me. Her face turned to solid stone. She stood up, pulled her leather handbag onto her shoulder, and looked Arthur dead in the eyes. Arthur Vance, she said, her voice dropping into a cold, disappointed line. You ought to be deeply ashamed of yourself. She turned on her heel and walked away, the second church lady following right behind her without saying a single word.
Wait. Sister Evelyn, wait. It's a misunderstanding, Arthur stammered, his voice cracking as he reached out toward them, his pious authority evaporating into thin air right in front of the entire room.
I didn't let him breathe. I reached into my coat lining, pulled out the second paper, the certified public copy of the $30,000 high-interest mortgage loan for Pine Creek Holdings, LLC, and slid it across the wet laminate, right into Aunt May's lap. Aunt May picked up the paper with trembling, spotted hands. She looked at the header. She looked at the address for 412 Maple Street, her home. And then her eyes landed on page 4, where her name was signed in Arthur's sharp, right-slanted handwriting. In that exact microsecond, Aunt May's lifelong terror of abandonment didn't just break. It transformed into something terrifyingly loud. Her face went completely white, then flushed into a dark, violent red. She stood up so fast her vinyl chair screeched against the rubber tiles like a dying animal. She held the forged loan document up in Arthur's face. Aunt May's voice cracked into a raw, breathless shriek, her trembling hands accidentally knocking her plastic cup off the edge of the wet table. You forged my name? Aunt May screamed. You put my house, my mother's house, on the line for a hunting cabin in the woods? Arthur backed up half a step, his hands flying up to shield his face. May, sweetie, listen to me. The Lord guided my hand to secure our family's future. Don't you dare speak the Lord's name to me, Aunt May roared. You stole from Rhea. You lied to me for 6 months. You forged my signature, you miserable, pathetic coward. Toby leaned over his father's shoulder, his eyes wide as he read the municipal notice attached to the repossession mandate. The notice explicitly identified his custom quads and personal hunting gear as unauthorized property located on an illegally encumbered parcel, subject to immediate impoundment by the county municipal enforcement currently executing the mandate at the logging gate. Toby's face turned the color of wet ash. He looked at Arthur, looked at the security guards walking slowly toward their table, and realized his weekend kingdom was completely gone. He didn't defend his father. He didn't say a word to Aunt May. He backed away from the table, grabbed his wet fleece vest off the floor and slunk toward the exit stairwell like a beaten dog, hiding his face from the hospital staff. I reached into the leather cuff of my right work glove. I pulled out the small, mud-stained receipt for 84 gallons of premium off-road diesel fuel and gently dropped it onto the tray, right beside the overturned paper cup. The cafeteria was an absolute war zone around us. Aunt May was screaming at Arthur, demanding the name of a divorce attorney, while Arthur desperately tried to sit back down in his wheelchair, his hands trembling as he tried to put on his plastic pulse oximeter to fake another chest spasm. But nobody was buying it. The floor nurse was already shaking her head, and 2 hospital security officers were standing 5 feet away, their arms crossed, watching him with cold, disgusted eyes. I took one slow bearing for the wet coats on the floor. I looked Uncle Arthur dead in his bloodshot, terrified eyes. The repossession is already finalized, Uncle, so you can stop screaming in the cafeteria because my shift starts in 10 minutes and I need my thermos. The rain was still falling when I walked out through the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby, holding my father's dented steel thermos tight against my ribs. Behind me, down in the basement cafeteria, the sound of Arthur's voice was still bouncing off those concrete pillars, a high-pitched, desperate screech that was already losing its strength. I mean, he tried to keep the sermon going. While Aunt May was screaming at him about her forged signature and the hospital security guards were stepping in to clear the aisle, Arthur frantically grabbed his cell phone off the wet laminate table. His hands were dripping with lukewarm chicken broth, his thumbs slipping wildly across the glass as he tried to speed dial his old golfing buddy, the county compliance director over in the 2nd District. He actually thought he could use his old boy network to override a certified court order. He held that phone to his ear, his chest heaving, trying to fake another medical spasm right in front of the head floor nurse. But here's the thing. The nurse didn't even call for a gurney. She just stood there with her arms crossed, looking at him with this dead, unblinking disgust, while the security guard reached down and gently plucked the pulse oximeter clip out of his pocket. They had all just watched a dying man leap out of a wheelchair, slam his fists down hard enough to flip a tray, and roar at the top of his lungs. The performance was over. The stage had collapsed right under his feet, and when he finally got the call through to the county dispatch office, the iron curtain of private administrative bureaucracy slammed down on his head. Arthur didn't get his compliance friend on the line. Because the Civil Enforcement Division had already logged the repossession mandate into the regional database at 6 o'clock that morning, the emergency line automatically routed his call to the automated civil recovery desk. I learned later from a friend who worked dispatch that Arthur redialed 5 separate times from that cafeteria, his voice getting higher and more frantic with every attempt, only to hear the exact same recorded clinical voice repeating through the speaker. Civil asset recovery in progress under Municipal Order 408B. Property impoundment authorized. Do not interfere with bonded recovery agents. He was trapped. The slow, boring machinery of the legal system, the very system he thought he was too holy and clever to ever get caught by, was grinding him down to dust, one automated recording at a time. By 7:15 a.m., while Arthur was still standing in that cafeteria trying to figure out why his local favors weren't working, 2 heavy, flatbed municipal tow trucks were already pulling up to the logging gate past the Pine Line. Miller had driven down from the shipyard lot in his own utility rig to supervise the recovery. They broke the padlocks on the aluminum awning, unbolted my generator chassis from the cabin wall, and loaded my primary work truck onto the flatbed. By noon, my $28,000 rig was sitting safely back inside the gated lot at the fabrication shop, clean, undamaged, and completely cleared of any legal encumbrance. Look, real justice doesn't happen in a single dramatic explosion like you see in the movies. It's much colder than that. It's an agonizing, slow-burn liquidation that strips a predator down to the bare wire over 6 long months. First came the ecosystem cannibalization. The second Aunt May realized Arthur had forged her signature to put her childhood home on the line for a timber cabin, her lifelong terror of dying alone completely evaporated. She hired a ruthless civil divorce attorney before the week was out. The court ordered an immediate injunction freezing all of Arthur's liquid accounts and forced the emergency liquidation of the Pine Creek Holdings property. The luxury hunting cabin was put on the auction block to pay off the $30,000 private mortgage, wiping out every single cent of equity Arthur thought he had built. When the dust settled on the civil filings, Aunt May kept her house, but Arthur was left with absolute zero. And then came Toby, my arrogant cousin, the guy who used to strut around in designer fleece vests, lecturing me about how a real woman ought to be supporting her male elders while he played with my stolen truck, suffered the exact physical ruin he used to mock me for. When Aunt May threw Arthur out of the house, she locked Toby out right along with him. Toby had no savings, no trade skills, and zero work ethic. Within 3 weeks, he was forced to take a night shift job at a commercial highway truck stop 20 miles out of town, scrubbing heavy grease traps and mopping oil spills off the concrete bays. I saw him once through the window of my backup truck when I stopped for diesel. He was wearing a pair of cheap, uninsulated yellow rubber boots with a split seam along the left heel, his hands red and raw from cold water, scrubbing a filthy drain while wealthy travelers stepped right past him without looking down. He caught my eye through the glass, his face turning bright red with pure, humiliating shame, and he instantly looked down at the puddle, ducking behind a trash bin to hide his face. The guy who used to mock my taped safety goggles was now scrubbing floors for minimum wage in split boots. But Uncle Arthur's karmic end, honestly, it was almost poetic in how brutal it turned out to be. Because he had been publicly exposed for medical fraud in front of his church prayer group, his entire social shield vanished overnight. Nobody would give him a loan. Nobody would let him sleep on their couch. He was forced to move into a tiny, unheated basement efficiency apartment behind a dry cleaning shop downtown. To cover his court-ordered civil restitution fees, he had to take the only job that didn't require a clean background check or a professional reference. He became a night shift janitor at the very hospital where he had spent 6 months faking cardiology crises. Think about that for a second. The man who used to sit in a high-backed chrome wheelchair beneath those fluorescent lights, holding court like a holy patriarch while nursing a paper cup of organic broth, was now pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket across those exact rubber floor tiles at 2 o'clock in the morning. He wore a stiff, faded blue synthetic uniform shirt with a generic name tag pinned over his pocket, his back slouched as he scrubbed the grease stains left by the daily breakfast crowd. The ultimate collapse hit him 3 months later. Not in a courtroom, but in a discount hardware store on the edge of town. I was standing in aisle 4, picking up a box of heavy-duty stainless steel hose clamps for a pipeline contract. I turned the corner near the clearance bins, and there he was. Arthur was standing in front of a wire rack of discount clothing, looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. His hair was unwashed. His skin had that dull, yellowish tone of someone living on cheap canned food, and his hands were trembling as he tried to adjust his clothes. He was holding a $3 synthetic leather belt he had just pulled off a clearance peg, trying frantically to notch it through his belt loops to hold up his faded trousers. He pulled the cheap vinyl strap tight, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing hitches. And then, crack! The cheap plastic buckle snapped clean in half. The synthetic strap whipped out of his hands, and his oversized trousers instantly dropped straight down to his ankles, right there in the middle of the main aisle. He stood there in his faded cotton undershorts, his thin, pale legs exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp of sheer horror. He scrambled frantically, dropping to his knees on the cold concrete floor, his trembling hands grabbing at the denim fabric, trying to pull his pants back up, while 2 teenage shoppers walked past him, laughing and shaking their heads. Nobody offered to help him. Nobody asked if he was okay. He was just a pathetic, broken old man, scrambling on the floor of a discount store, completely invisible to the world he had spent his life trying to fool. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. I just stood there at the end of the aisle, holding my box of hose clamps, watching him struggle to pull his trousers up over his hips. The grand patriarch, the holy leader who claimed the Lord needed me to sacrifice my life for his comfort, was reduced to a miserable ghost begging a cheap plastic buckle to hold his life together. 2 weeks after the collapse in the hospital cafeteria, Aunt May showed up at the main gate of the commercial fabrication yard. She was sitting in the driver's seat of her small sedan with the engine idling, her hands gripping the plastic steering wheel so tight her knuckles were completely white. When I walked over to her window, she didn't look like the dramatic, fainting woman who had spent 6 months fanning herself in hospital armchairs. She looked hollowed out, completely consumed by the raw, pathetic terror of being left alone in an empty house. She rolled down the glass, her eyes swollen and red, her voice dropping into a shaky, desperate plead as her hands reached out through the window to grab the canvas sleeve of my work coat. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask how I was surviving on 14-hour shifts with taped safety goggles. She begged me to withdraw my civil affidavits against Arthur's Cabin LLC. She kept crying that if the court liquidated the timber lot, Arthur would never come back to her, that he would leave her to rot alone in that old house on Maple Street, and that I was the only one who could stop the lawyers from stripping her life apart. I stood there in the cold rain, looking down at her trembling fingers clutching my sleeve. In high-pressure industrial pipe fabrication, when a heavy carbon steel weld suffers from severe hydrogen embrittlement, the atomic structure of the metal itself gets corrupted from the inside out. Microscopic bubbles of trapped gas seep into the grain boundaries of the joint, causing tiny, invisible fissures beneath the surface. You can't fix embrittlement by laying another bead of hot filler metal over the top. You can't polish it with a wire wheel, and you can't melt soft solder into the gap to hide the crack. Once the atomic lattice separates under hydraulic stress, the joint is dead. If you try to force pressure through an embrittled line, it will blow apart and take the whole manifold down with it. Looking at my aunt's tear-stained face through that open car window, I realized that our blood connection had suffered complete intergranular failure. There was no metal left to weld. The grain structure of our family was gone, replaced by decades of trapped gas, fake chest spasms, and silent compliance. I didn't yell at her. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't give her a tearful speech about betrayal or forgiveness. I reached into the heavy inner lining of my work jacket, pulled out a certified copy of the formal, no-contact boundary notice drafted by my civil attorney, and laid it neatly against her steering wheel. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice completely flat. May, my attorney handles all communication regarding the estate and the equipment recovery now. Do not come to my job site again. I stepped back from the car door, turned my back on her weeping, and walked through the heavy steel gate. I heard her sedan door click shut behind me, the tires grinding slowly over the gravel turnout as she drove away into the fog. That was the legal wall. Cold, quiet, and permanently sealed, with zero room left for negotiation. By the second week of November, the civil court orders had completed their slow, boring, unyielding work. The bank's fraud division executed a full title clawback on the stolen machinery. My primary utility truck was officially re-registered in my name alone, the court clearing every single fraudulent lien Arthur had tried to attach to the title. Miller helped me bolt my custom $28,000 diesel generator back onto the heavy steel chassis behind my cab. We rewired the three-phase output breakers, replaced the fuel filters, and set the mechanical governor back to my exact idle specifications. When I turned the key on the main control box, the heavy four-cylinder motor fired up on the first crank, settling into that crisp, flawless 1800 RPM cyclic throb. No missing beats, no hairline baffle rattles, just pure, unadulterated industrial power, completely recovered, fully restored, and paid for with my own sweat. The ledger was finally zeroed out. It was 6:30 on a clear, freezing Tuesday morning out on the shipyard pier. The rain had finally cleared, leaving the river basin covered in a thin blanket of crisp white frost that sparkled under the early dawn light. The air smelled of salt water, cold iron, and fresh diesel exhaust. I was standing on the elevated platform of a high-pressure steam line extension project, wearing my heavy canvas jacket and my new safety hood. On the viewport rested my new $42 replacement visor, crystal clear, completely smooth, without a single crack or a single strip of electrical tape blocking my sight. Beside my work boots, sitting on the clean steel deck plate of my utility truck right next to the generator panel, was my father's dented steel thermos. I reached down, picked up the heavy vessel, and unscrewed the worn steel cap. A thick plume of white steam rose into the freezing morning air, carrying the rich, bitter smell of hot black tea. I took a slow sip, letting the heat spread down through my chest, warming my throat and my lungs. My thumb moved over the side of the vessel, tracing the deep dent near the base where that impact wrench had struck it 30 years ago. I could feel the rough, oxidized texture of the bare metal, the cold endurance of a piece of steel that had survived freezing mud, falling tools, and decades of hard labor without ever losing its vacuum seal. My father didn't leave me a luxury cabin in the woods or a pile of unearned money. He left me a dented thermos, and he taught me how to hold a steady torch when the world tries to shake your hands. I set the thermos cap back down on the deck, pulled my welding hood down over my face, and struck the arc. A brilliant, pristine blue flame erupted from the tip of my torch, illuminating the clean carbon steel of the pipe joint under the clear morning sky. I watched the molten metal flow evenly into the root pass, smooth, pure, and completely free of slag. I took off my gloves and shut off the gas valves. I didn't leave a forwarding address or a margin for error. The structural ties are permanently severed, the defective welds have been cut out of the manifold, and the pipeline is finally purged of toxic gas. The pressure is zero.